Today, the welfare queen, Trope, may invoke an image of a black woman driving through downtown Chicago in a pink Cadillac with the top down, someone draped in expensive fabrics, dripping in jewels, all at the taxpayer's expense. This narrative, first reported by George Bliss in a 1974 article published in the Chicago Tribune and a month later in Jet magazine, would soon become a political weapon for conservatives. Indeed, Ronald Reagan, the actor-turned-politician who enjoyed telling stories on the campaign trail, latched on to the account of the welfare queen, a trope that continues to haunt the black community. To justify cutting welfare programs designed to alleviate poverty, former President Ronald Reagan villainized Linda Taylor, a black woman who really did exploit the system. In a 1976 campaign rally, he induced shock and awe by revealing details about her case. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans' benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veteran husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year. Despite his presentation of facts, something was misleading about the way Reagan framed the story. A case study can reveal valuable details about a particular individual. And yet, the main limitation of this research method is generalizability. This means that you cannot assume that what you learn from investigating one case of suspected welfare fraud will apply to the broader population of welfare recipients. You would have to survey a wider segment of the population to draw any meaningful conclusion about group behavior. However, in politics, where case studies are often amplified to garner public support, this grain of salt didn't stand a chance. As Josh Levin wrote for Slate, with her story, Reagan marked millions of America's poorest people as potential scoundrels and fostered the belief that welfare fraud was a nationwide epidemic that needed to be stamped out. His goal was to portray all welfare recipients as scam artists unworthy of government assistance, or even compassion. Of course, most families receiving welfare were not gaming the system. Despite working hard, many relied on government programs such as food stamps to feed themselves and support their families. The minimum wage was not a living wage, and black workers made significantly less than their white counterparts, even when working the same types of jobs. However, Reagan could not convince American voters that the government should cut welfare programs by sharing stories of hardworking, tax-paying citizens struggling to make ends meet. So, he used Taylor's case, where the public witnessed a woman proudly flaunting her ill-gotten gains, to portray poor and black people as thieves, heavily suggesting that this one case of fraud was reflective of wide-scale abuse. Reagan's political rhetoric was largely successful, as it lent plausible deniability to conservatives who wanted to cut programs without backlash. If they could keep the myth alive, they could easily limit, and in some cases, block access to these programs. Yet, there are many people who, despite qualifying for government assistance, do not apply because of the stigma welfare recipients face. This is one of the many ways Reagan's welfare queen trope haunts the black community in the modern era. Some black people avoid applying for government assistance because they don't want to be seen as looking for a handout. This means even some who are genuinely struggling may avoid help. Researchers, in recent years, have identified a link between the stigmatization of welfare recipients and healthcare outcomes. For instance, a study published in the British Journal of Political Science found that welfare recipients exposed to deservingness messaging reported an increased use of antidepressants. Beckard et al., 2023. Findings in social science and medicine found welfare stigma is linked to poor health outcomes for Black and Hispanic mothers. Lapham and Martinson, 2022. Far from the trope of the welfare queen, who enjoyed receiving government assistance, many Black women and women of color experienced psychological distress after hearing deservingness discourse. and these negative portrayals of them as undeserving perpetuated poor health outcomes. Reagan's strategy of associating government assistance with fraud is rooted in our nation's history of overt racism. For instance, one poster criticizing so-called radical Republicans during the Reconstruction era claimed the Freedmen's Bureau was an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Of course, the notion that black Americans were idle at any part of the country's history at the expense of white people is absurd. No racial group has worked more for less pay and benefits. Yet, the image of a black man, stereotypically represented with dark skin, large lips, and a vacant stare, lounging as a white man tended the fields, acted as powerful propaganda to oppose any assistance granted to the formerly enslaved. As long as former Confederates could portray black people as lazy, they could deprive them of restorative justice and attack any policy designed to help them on the basis that they were undeserving. By putting a spotlight on the welfare queen, Reagan attempted to discredit social programs. In doing so, he fed into a very old yet effective stereotype that those black and poor people seeking assistance didn't need help. Reaganomics, or supply-side economics that sought to stimulate economic growth by reducing government regulation, left black Americans worse off economically. This top-down approach failed to close the racial wealth gap. Yet, the belief that many black people were living wealthy off government assistance persisted. One report revealed that states that have a larger population of black people have less generous and more restrictive welfare policies. These findings demonstrate how some of Reagan's ideas about cutting social programs and making it more difficult for black people to receive government assistance are still influential. Like a ghost with unfinished business, the trope has lingered, and it will take substantial effort to rid ourselves of the lasting impact. While Reagan never explicitly mentioned the race of the welfare queen, Americans knew he was referring to Taylor, a black woman whose criminal behavior attracted national attention. The only one granted such an alias. The former president spent much of his career trying to block racial progress. For instance, he opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And while running to become California's governor in 1966, he shared his opinion that if an individual wants to discriminate against Negroes or others in selling or renting his house, he has a right to do so. While many black Americans were fighting for the right to live free of discrimination, Reagan was fighting for white Americans' right to discriminate. Reagan's welfare queen trope haunts American political discourse. We haven't shaken ourselves free from the trope. Policies designed to strengthen the social safety net are still controversial. There's an undercurrent, an assumption that poor people in general, and black people in particular, are undeserving of assistance. And this attitude contributes to a society where those languishing in poverty are accused of overindulging. Last spring, Gary Pilnick, Kellogg's CEO, suggested America's families give chicken a break and eat cereal for lunch or dinner. Some noted his approach sounded out of touch, reminiscent of the rumored quote of the French Queen, Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake." However, those familiar with America's history will know this is a new reiteration of something quite old, blaming the poor for their plight and offering untenable solutions. While the welfare queen trope portrays black people as eager to exploit state and federal resources, the truth is much less luxurious. Racial disparities persist as the government has never engaged in restorative justice. The diminished status of black people and racial minorities in American society is not reflective of a character flaw but an unjust system. Despite efforts to portray black people as lazy or undeserving, these are nothing more than legitimizing myths. Stories told over a political bonfire to inspire resistance to racial progress. And it's up to us to separate trope from reality. Americans should not allow one person's narrative to cast dispersions upon an entire race of people.